What countries are most likely to start WW3? 4:16 a.m. The radar screen blooms with a second echo over the cold Baltic air. It should be empty, but it isn't. The operator hears the headset crackle, then a clipped command to recheck the track and confirm. Outside the bunker, the wind pushes sleet against steel doors like fingernails. A city 3 time zones away keeps sleeping under dim streetlights and thin curtains. Then the first siren test turns into a real siren, and nobody believes it. Phones buzz with vague alerts, then freeze as towers choke. You taste metal in the back of your throat, and you don't know why. Somewhere a leader reads a printed card with 3 options, and none of them feel human. Somewhere else another leader watches a map and sees only humiliation or escalation. As the world holds its breath, where will you be when the first mistake becomes policy? This is how it starts, not with a speech, but with a signal that arrives too fast to debate. It begins as an incident, then becomes a response, then becomes a doctrine. In that instant, the old world doesn't just shake. A new, harder one begins. The missile doesn't launch first in the public story, because the public never gets the first story. The trigger is smaller, sharper, and easier to deny. A hypersonic test corridor overlaps a commercial lane by a few degrees, and the warning time collapses. A naval patrol crosses an invisible line, and 2 captains decide pride matters more than distance. You don't hear the classified phrases, but you feel their consequences. The airspace changes, and flights vanish from the board like erased chalk. The news anchors speak faster, as if speed can outrun reality. In secure rooms, staffers pull binders marked with old acronyms and new fear. The countries most likely to ignite a wider war are not always the ones that want it most. They are the ones sitting on fault lines, living with humiliation, or relying on threats to survive. They are the ones whose politics reward escalation and punish restraint, especially under cameras and deadlines. The first country is the one that can't afford to look weak on its borders. Its pilots shadow foreign aircraft in gray skies, close enough to see helmet visors. Its ships cross bow to bow in narrow seas where a single wake becomes a weapon. It tells its public that encirclement is real, and the public believes it. In that country, the military doctrine treats speed as safety and escalation as leverage. Leaders use limited strikes as a bargaining tool, not a last resort. They keep nuclear language close to the mouth, like a knife kept near the plate. The fear is not just invasion, but embarrassment that spreads. A border clash is never just a border clash when alliances are stitched across maps. A stray shell lands over a line, and the wrong flag is on the damaged vehicle. A radar lock lasts 2 seconds too long, and someone calls it a hostile act. Then the emergency meeting starts, and the room smells like stale coffee and panic. You see the early signs as patterns, not explosions. There are more unconfirmed reports, more technical failures, more temporary restrictions. The government tells you not to speculate, while it quietly moves fuel reserves. The markets swing like a door in a storm, and everyone pretends it is normal. The second country is the one that gets dragged, not because it must, but because it can't let allies fall. It is tied to treaty language that turns distant violence into domestic obligation. When a partner is hit, the credibility of the entire network goes on trial. Leaders fear that doing nothing becomes an invitation. That country's power is global, which means its mistakes become global too. A carrier group moves, and satellite images turn it into a headline. Bomber deployments look like theater until they don't, and then they look like fate. Rivals read every move as preparation for regime change, even if it isn't. Inside that country, escalation wears a civilized face. It comes with briefings, committees, and legal memos that approve force in calm fonts. It comes with TV panels arguing about red lines while families check deployment cycles. Then the first cyber outage hits, and debate turns into survival. The third country is the one staring across a strait at an island that defines its legitimacy. It calls the island internal business, then treats the ocean like a gate it owns. Its drills become rehearsals, and rehearsals become routines that can slip into real operations. It believes time is running out because demography and prestige are clocks. The trigger here doesn't need a landing on a beach. It can start as a quarantine, a customs enforcement, a so-called safety corridor. On paper it looks bureaucratic, but in practice it is siege math. Shipping slows, planes reroute, and the world's supply chains begin to cough. Then comes the collision that no one can take back. Two ships scrape steel, and cameras catch the sparks. A missile flies as a warning and hits a radar site that cannot be allowed to die. A base far from the strait takes a strike, and suddenly it is not about one island anymore. You feel this pathway first through prices and delays. Replacement parts don't arrive not because they don't exist, but because insurance costs spike. Shelves thin, not from scarcity, but from hoarding triggered by rumor. In living rooms, people talk about war like weather, as if naming it makes it manageable. The fourth country is the one that survives by being unpredictable. It is smaller than its threats, but its threats are enough to force attention. It tests missiles like punctuation. Each launches sentence in a long coercion campaign. It doesn't need victory, only crisis. On its border, artillery sips like a loaded breath. The capital across the line lives within reach, and everyone knows it. A short exchange can kill thousands before diplomats even board planes. In such a crisis, leaders feel trapped between retaliation and restraint, and both feel fatal. This is where misinterpretation becomes a weapon. A limited strike on a launch site looks defensive to one side and existential to the other. The regime assumes the next step is decapitation, because decapitation is what its propaganda expects. So it escalates first, believing delay equals death. You notice the region shifting into a drill culture. Shelters get marked, subway stations get inspected, and emergency alerts become routine. People stock water and radios not because they are paranoid, but because they are tired of surprise. The world watches, yawns, then suddenly stops yawning. The fifth country is the one bound into energy arteries and proxy networks. It sits near a choke point that turns local violence into global shock. It can't always win a direct fight, but it can make the fight expensive enough to drag others in. It understands that tankers and pipelines are nerves. A crisis begins with a drone that hits a refinery at dawn. Flames rise like a new sun, and the market reacts in seconds. Shipping lanes tighten, warships escort, and every escort creates a potential incident. Then a base gets struck, and national pride becomes combustible. Proxy groups activate like switches. Rockets fly from one frontier, drones from another, and suddenly the map is a web. Each strike comes with plausible denial, and denial buys time for escalation. The danger is not one battlefield, but multiple, stitched together by revenge. You feel this war in your wallet before you see it on maps. Fuel climbs, insurance climbs, food transport costs climb, and wages don't. The public calls it inflation, but it is strategic friction. It is the price of uncertainty applied to every kilometer of trade. The sixth pathway is not one country, but a pair that share history, hatred, and nuclear capability. Their border is a scar that never closes. A terror attack happens, and within minutes the blame hardens into certainty. The public demands punishment, not investigation. A limited airstrike follows, framed as surgical and controlled. Then the other side must answer, because silence becomes weakness. Air defenses light up, jets cross lines, and one aircraft falls in the wrong place. Suddenly funerals are televised, and escalation becomes a domestic requirement. Nuclear weapons here don't prevent war. They compress decision time. Every step feels like climbing a ladder with missing rungs. Mediators call, but mediation itself is interpreted as bias. In that atmosphere, even a false rumor can mobilize battalions. You see the social effect in how quickly normal life becomes conditional. Schools close temporarily and stay closed. Trains run with soldiers, not commuters, and nobody takes photos anymore. People check routes out of cities not because they will leave today, but because they might. Now the trigger and confusion phase begins, and the world doesn't agree on the trigger. One side calls it a defensive intercept. Another calls it a first strike. The truth becomes irrelevant because perception decides policy. In the first hour, leaders speak in fragments and do not show faces. The information gap grows like mold in darkness. Official channels publish bland statements and ask for calm. Meanwhile, private group chats explode with shaky footage and fake maps. The public lurches between denial and obsession, refreshing screens that refuse to load. You can hear the system strain in tiny sounds. The cell network drops into emergency mode, and your calls fail. Your bank app loads slowly, then not at all. The street feels quieter because everyone is indoors listening for updates that never arrive clean. Behind the scenes, technical systems shift posture. Air defense radars change scan patterns. Submarines receive burst transmissions that last seconds and carry days of consequence. Staff officers open sealed envelopes and speak in numbers, not nouns. DEFCON language doesn't appear on your screen, but the outcomes do. Police cancel leave, hospitals clear beds, and government buildings increase perimeter checks. Freight gets rerouted, not because roads are blocked, but because targets are being predicted. The country prepares as if certainty exists, even when it doesn't. Human psychology turns ugly fast under uncertainty. People start with jokes, then stop laughing. They begin hoarding because someone else might hoard first. They distrust neighbors, not for what they did, but for what they might do when panic peaks. The breakdown phase arrives like a series of small betrayals. ATMs show temporarily unavailable, and you tell yourself it is a glitch. Gas pumps require authorization that never comes because networks linked to frozen payment processors. Store shelves empty in hours not due to shortages but due to fear. The grid doesn't fail everywhere at once because the grid is not a single switch. It fails in patches as systems isolate and protect themselves. A substation trips, then another, then a cascading logic kicks in. You sit in a room where the power flickers like a dying pulse. SCADA screens freeze in control centers, showing green lights that are now lies. Operators switch to manual procedures written for old disasters. They coordinate through radios because IP networks are under attack or under load. Every minute without stable power multiplies problems because everything depends on everything. Cell towers overload, then become silent monuments. People step outside holding phones like compasses that no longer point north. Cars queue at intersections where traffic lights are dead. The sound of horns becomes the soundtrack of confusion, then of anger. Hospitals run on generators, but generators eat fuel. Fuel deliveries require roads, security, and scheduling that no longer function. Staff members sleep on floors because commuting is too risky. The fear in their eyes is not just for patients, but for their own families. Water pressure drops in taller buildings first. You open a tap and hear air sputter before the last thin stream. Elevators stop, and stairwells become the new arteries. In the dark, every footstep sounds like someone following you. The internet becomes a patchwork of islands. Some sites load, others vanish, and nobody knows which information is real. AI-generated fakes flood the gap, confident and detailed and wrong. Information at this moment is poison disguised as clarity. People begin to form lines without knowing what the line is for. A rumor about a fuel truck creates a crowd in minutes. A rumor about evacuation creates traffic that blocks emergency vehicles. The supermarket shelves aren't empty because of scarcity alone. They are empty because trust collapses. Then comes the first visible act of state power on your street. Soldiers guard a substation, rifles angled down but ready. Police enforce curfews that nobody asked for yesterday. Drones buzz overhead, not for spectacle, but for crowd monitoring. The shift from civilized to primal is not cinematic. It is mundane and humiliating. It is arguing over batteries, over bottled water, over a place in line. It is realizing that your money is numbers trapped in a dead network. In the background, the geopolitical response hardens. Emergency NATO meetings happen in sealed rooms, and communiques come out watered down. Retaliatory strikes are debated as if they are accounting entries. Silence from leadership becomes its own signal, because silence means options are being weighed. A single treaty clause becomes a cliff edge. Article 5 language hovers like a storm cloud, because invoking it makes the war real. Leaders search for ways to respond without igniting the next rung. But every limited action is read by someone else as a rehearsal for total war. Across the Indo-Pacific, fleets disperse because concentration invites destruction. Anti-ship missiles and submarines make ocean space lethal. Satellites watch for launch signatures, and analysts argue over pixels. The time between detection and decision shrinks until it barely exists. Now the new normal begins, and it is defined by rationing and suspicion. Those who prepared become quiet, not proud. Those who didn't become desperate, not evil, until desperation teaches them new behavior. Neighborhoods start forming watch rotations because police cannot be everywhere. The invisible threat is not always radiation, though radiation haunts every conversation. The invisible threat is also uncertainty, the inability to verify anything. You cannot tell if a distant explosion is real or edited. You cannot tell if a government statement is calming or coding. If nuclear weapons enter the equation, they enter first as posture. Warheads are moved, not used, but the movement itself is a message. Submarines change patrol boxes, bomber wings disperse, and command posts go underground. The world becomes a set of hardened nodes preparing for impact. Fallout planning reappears in public guidance, awkward and outdated. Officials tell people to shelter, seal windows, and stay calm. The advice is technically correct and psychologically impossible. You tape plastic over vents and wonder if tape can stop history. Radiation is cruel because it is quiet. It doesn't smell like smoke or roar like artillery. It sits on dust, on clothes, on hair, and it follows you indoors. People fear it the way they fear betrayal, because it is unseen and persistent. Rationing starts with requests, then becomes enforcement. Fuel goes to emergency services first, then to logistics, then to whoever can prove necessity. Food distribution centers appear in school gyms. The line becomes your new calendar. Money changes shape. Cash returns as king, but cash runs out. Barter rises, but barter invites theft. People begin pricing items in batteries, canned food, and medication. The economy becomes a survival math problem. In some places, cyber-sabotage continues even after bombs stop falling. Malware sits in systems like landmines waiting for restart. Water treatment plants struggle because sensors cannot be trusted. The city smells different when sanitation fails, and you never forget it. The macro view is bleak and clinical. Great powers issue warnings that sound like ultimatums. Smaller states choose sides under pressure because neutrality becomes a luxury. Diplomats shuttle, but every flight is a target in someone's imagination. The countries most likely to start the wider war are also the ones most likely to claim they didn't. They will call it defense, deterrence, restoration, reunification, security. They will insist they were forced, cornered, provoked. They will speak as if history is an alibi. But the truth in this scenario is simple and terrifying. World War doesn't require evil plans, only rigid systems and fragile leaders. It requires pride, miscalculation, and the belief that escalation is controllable. It requires technology that moves faster than wisdom. Now the aftermath phase settles in, and it is not an ending. It is a long emergency with occasional violence and constant scarcity. People measure time by generator fuel and water access, not by weekends. The world feels smaller because travel becomes risk. You learn that safety was never a wall. It was a web of agreements and electricity. When the web tears, everything falls through. The lesson is not to live in fear, but to understand dependencies. A modern life is an illusion held together by supply chains and trust. You also learn something harder about yourself and everyone around you. Most people are not monsters, but hunger makes ethics negotiable. Most people are not heroes, but responsibility can be learned in minutes when needed. The difference is preparation and mindset. The haunting reality is that the spark can come from many places, but the fire spreads the same way. It spreads through treaties, shipping lanes, alliances, and retaliation logic. It spreads through the human inability to back down in front of an audience. So you keep a small reserve, not because you expect apocalypse, but because systems fail under stress. You keep a radio because the internet can lie and collapse. You keep documents ready because evacuation is chaos without identity. You keep your mind calm because panic is the first enemy